There's my mom. Yes. How to get my picture back again. Should we start? Well, welcome. My name is Lorna Truck, and I think I know most of you. Um, and many of you knew my mom, Helen Young. Fred and I are fairly new residents here. We moved in May. And during the summer, I have spent a lot of time doing tours of Woodland Cemetery. I went on a number of tours of Woodland Cemetery and discovered that it was mostly men being talked about on the tours. So I met another young woman on the tour named Kat Renkin, and we decided that we'd put together a tour of women for the Woodland Cemetery. So what you're going to see today is what I'm calling a virtual tour. It's of the women that we talk about in the cemetery, but since we're not walking around, I can actually add a lot more women than we can do on the tour. And I put it in the order that we walk around the cemetery in the tour. So you're going to see them in the order of the cemetery, and welcome. So we'll walk around as if we were walking around in the cemetery. And for most of the women, I have a picture of their marker that's in Woodland Cemetery. So the women of this period, I'm going to be talking about the Civil War through 1920 with the passage of the suffrage amendments so that women could vote. The women of this period did not have a lot of political power by themselves. They couldn't vote, so that really cut out a lot of their political power. But they were activists, and they were interested in making social change. So they banded together in groups. There are many, many different clubs from this period. One of them, which is a big club at the time, was the Des Moines Women's Club. And this is a picture of the charter members of the Des Moines Women's Club, which started in 1885. And there were a number of very active social reformers as part of that club. It was not a suffrage club. They were not working directly to get the right to vote. They were working for social reform for families and children and the working poor, people who needed improvements in their conditions. They formed orphanages and retirement homes and various other social institutions. And the way they did it was they banded together in clubs. They also had clubs that were working just for the right to vote. But the Des Moines Women's Club was a little bit broader. I lost my mom here again. This is my mom, if anybody, I don't know why she's showing up. She's probably looking over my shoulder here. Okay. I did a lot of my research in the archives of the Des Moines Women's Club because many of these women were members of the club. And I think the club formed after a big women's convention, a national women's convention in Des Moines in 1885. And right after that, these Des Moines women felt that they really needed a club here in Des Moines that could get some social change happening. So I'm going to talk a few minutes about Woodland Cemetery because it's celebrated its 175th anniversary this year. It's a beautiful cemetery. If you haven't been there, I would recommend walking or driving through the cemetery. It's got gorgeous old oak trees. It's got 50,000 interments. There are a lot of people buried there. And it's got a lot of variety of monuments and markers, so it makes it a very interesting place to go. It was built on the outskirts of town. When it was built 175 years ago, it was in the suburbs. And you know where it is now. It's right over by M.L. King and 235, so it's right in the center of town now. But it was built on 4 acres that were donated by 4 different farmers who had farms right in that area. And that's how it got started. Now it's much bigger than 4 acres. All the graves were marked and the monuments put in before there were roads. The roads were put in by the WPA in 1938. But if you've been there recently, you'll see that they're working on the roads and it's in much better condition than it's been in years. You may be familiar with the first walking tours that were done by Gerald LeBlanc. Maybe some of you took those tours. He was a history teacher at Callanan and had the first idea to do walking tours. And his tour is still being done by Archie Cook every summer. So you can still get Gerald's information in that tour. And then recently, Christine Bartley, and some of you may have heard Christine speak here earlier this year, has done a project to put QR codes by some of the graves. And QR codes are those little things you scan with your phone. If you scan those, you can see a video about the person who's buried there. So that's really added a lot of information. And it's something that is accessible. For some people, it's hard to walk through the cemetery because the ground is very uneven. But you can drive through and stop and look at those QR codes and learn a lot about the people who are buried there. Let's see. So this is a picture of this Woodland Cemetery. And up here is 235 St. Ambrose Cemetery, which is a separate cemetery, a Catholic cemetery, is up at the top right up here. And then this is Emmanuel Cemetery, and that's the Jewish cemetery. And then there is a Oddfellows Cemetery right here. Those were all separate to begin with. And then there are 2 Grand Army of the Republic plots. You can see here, GAR plots. There's one here and one here. Those are all Civil War veterans who managed to survive the Civil War because you couldn't be a member if you died in the Civil War because it wasn't formed until afterwards. So the people in those plots are veterans who survived the Civil War. Now you'll see a lot of other graves of people who died during the Civil War also in the Woodland Cemetery. So it's a really neat historic spot. My tour starts over here and goes this way. We don't cover the whole cemetery. We come back this way. So it's about 2 hours and about a 1.5 mile walk. And we'll be doing it again next summer if anyone's interested in going. Plus the other 2 cemetery tours of Woodland will be going again next summer. Now, some of my favorite markers in the cemetery are these tree stump markers. A lot of people think those are actually carved tree stumps, but what they are Woodmen of the World markers. And that was an insurance company and a fraternal organization at the turn of the century. And they had an insurance policy that included, when you died, you got a tree marker. So there are tree markers all over the cemetery, and each one of them is different. They have names. Some of them are really small if it was a young person, or some of them are for multiple family members. So that's a really fun thing to look for when you're walking through the cemetery. Okay, the first woman that we talk about when we go in is Frances Elizabeth Cooper Hubbell. She is buried in this mausoleum that is right at the entrance to the cemetery. So you can even see that as you drive by. It's a huge mausoleum with space underground for at least 25 interments. And it's got an elevator and electricity, and there's still some space in that monument. So So that I think is the biggest monument in the cemetery. Elizabeth, or Frances Elizabeth Hubbell, was a suffragist and was a member of the Des Moines Women's Club. She wasn't primarily political. She was more of a social kind of person, and she stayed out of the political limelight even though she worked for suffrage. But she lived at Terrace Hill with her husband, F.M. Hubbell, and she was very active behind the scenes in the suffrage movement. And in 1897, the National Suffrage Conference came to Des Moines, which was a huge deal. And it brought women from all over the country, including the really well-known women like Susan B. Anthony and various other, Carrie Chapman Catt. And many of these people stayed with the Hubballs, and they entertained the entire conference at their Terrace Hill home. So that was one of her big contributions to the suffrage movement. And this is a newspaper article about the event, and I'd just like to read a little bit of the description. The National Suffrage Association finally discovered Des Moines on the map, and during the last week of 1897, that body was in convention in the capital city. It was a historic body uniting under one roof the strong women who had made a name and a place for womanhood suffrage movement in every state of the Union. The officers of the association were hospitably entertained at Inglebry, the suburban home of Mrs. Callanan, that staunch advocate and pioneer advocate of reform. Among the notable women in attendance were Susan B. Anthony, Mrs. Carrie Chapman Catt, present head of the world movement of suffrage. And Mrs. Catt was a guest of Mrs. A.B. Cumming. We'll talk about her soon. So near the Hubbell Monument is a monument for Minnie Fleur. She was a social worker and a social reform activist and president of the Iowa Equal Suffrage Association. She was the first female elected public official in Des Moines when she was elected to the school board in 1912. She served for 3 years on the school board, but she didn't run again because she said nobody listened to her at all. They just weren't interested in having her here. She said the most unpleasant and futile task. The board was just not ready for women, and none of the male members would speak or listen to her. So that was one of the first women elected officials in Des Moines, and that's how she was treated. She served as a legislative chair for the Iowa Federation of Women's Club. She arranged for a monument for the World War I veterans that you'll see at Woodland Cemetery. And she was the wife of a veteran who died in World War I. So, and he's the, there's Mom again. He's the member who, he's the person that Fleur Drive is named for. Okay, I've got Minnie Fleur. Okay, then we go to the Orphans Memorial, which is just up the hill from the Fleur. And the Orphans Memorial now reads Orchard Place, and it has the names of 44 orphans who are buried in this small plot. It was originally an orphanage called the Home for Friendless Children, and it did not have a good monument, and the children are buried on top of each other in this little space. So Orchard Place replaced the memorial and put all the names of the children there. The Home for Friendless Children was another institution that was formed by Des Moines women. And there's several current organizations, including Orchard Place, Benedict Home, and Family Services of Children and Family Services of Iowa. They all claim the same origin story, which is a baby boy was left on the doorstep He was left on the doorstep of the Benedict home, and there was no orphanage in town and no group that could take care of him. So Mother Benedict, who was head of the Benedict home, took him home. They called him Charlie Basket. And all three of these organizations that I mentioned all claim this was the origin of their institution. And it definitely was the beginning of the Home for Friendless Children, because people realized, well, we have to have some kind of facility for children without any place to live. So the Home for Friendless Children started, and eventually it evolved into Orchard Place and the Children and Family Services of Iowa. And the Benedict home is still there as well. It's now on University by Polk Boulevard, and it's a transitional housing. It was originally a home for fallen women that was run by the WCTU. So they took unwed mothers in, but they did not have a facility for their babies. So that was another reason for the Home for Friendless Children. And the mothers were unable to keep their babies when they were at the Benedict home. Okay. Annie Nolan Savory is another burial with a very large burial vault. She was a member of the family that owned the Savory Hotel. And she was a pioneer woman suffrage. You can see she was born in 1831, so she was somewhat older than some of these other women. So she was in on the ground floor going around Iowa speaking for the rights of women. And she, because she was so early in taking up the cause, she had very hostile audiences to speak to. But she became prominent nationally and knew all the national suffrage leaders and spoke at a number of suffrage conferences. And then she became a friend of Victoria Woodhull, who was another national movement leader. Victoria Woodhull believed in something she called free love, which is not the kind of free love that we think of in the 1970s. It was more of just a women's rights movement. She believed that women should be able to have custody of their own children in divorce, and they should be able to have their own wealth and keep their own money, which was not the case, especially on the East Coast. The laws did not allow women to have their own money. If they got married, it became their husband's money. So this was Victoria Woodhull's cause, but she was just a little too radical for the Des Moines suffrage movement. So Annie Savory, who was basically talking about free speech and supporting Victoria Woodhull in her right to talk about free love, was moved out of the leadership of the Des Moines suffrage movement by kind of her adversary, Martha Callanan. Martha Callanan was just more conservative than Annie Savory, and she took over Savory's role as the leader of the Iowa suffrage movement. She became, in 1870, the charter member and president of the Polk County Women's Suffrage Association. And that same year, she helped organize the Iowa State Equal Suffrage Association. She was very active in politics and other social movements. She was a member of the WCTU, which was a more conservative movement, and I think they felt that Iowa wasn't ready for the more radical East Coast kind of suffrage movement. So, but Martha was very, very well known and very active. She founded the Des Moines Home for the Aged, which apparently was also supported and funded by Hubble, the husband of Elizabeth Hubble. And she was the second president of the Des Moines Women's Club. She also was a journalist and started the Women's Standard, which was the Iowa Women's Suffrage magazine. And she was one of the founders of the Benedict Home. So she was very busy in social reform. She died rather young of a carriage accident. Her carriage overturned in downtown Des Moines, and she died of that accident. And when she died, she had bequests for a number of institutions like the Home for the Aged in Des Moines, but also the Tuskegee Institute and the Women's Standard and the WCTU. Unfortunately, her husband, James Callanan, was able to overturn the will, and so he was able to keep her bequests, which is kind of a sad ending to her life of social activism. The Callanans, James Callanan was a businessman, and they lived in the area, well, their house was where Scottish Rite is now, and it was considered suburban Des Moines at that time. And they had a very large property that included Callanan Middle School, Ruby Van Meter, and Smouse schools. And at one point, they sold that large swath of property to Des Moines Public Schools, and their 3 public schools were on that property. This is a picture in Martha Callanan's house of a suffrage political equity club meeting at her house, which they called Inglebry in suburban Des Moines. Then we move on to the infant markers, which run all the way down the hill beyond the Savory Mausoleum. There were 536 babies buried there in unmarked graves on the south edge of the cemetery. It's right along the street in a wall. The markers were funded by Gerald LeBlanc, who was the tour instigator for the cemetery, and also the Abigail Adams chapter of the DAR. They did a big fundraising program and got markers for the 536 babies. There were smallpox and cholera epidemics between 1898 and 1905, and that's when these babies died. Some of them were babies from families who were traveling west. They just buried their child at the biggest town that they passed through. And one of those children was baby Frank Law, who was buried while his family was heading west. And the family knew that he had been buried somewhere along the way, that he had died along the way, but they did not know where he was buried. And they found the publicity for this big project of baby markers, and that's how they found out where he had been buried. And that's baby Frank Law right there. There are a number of QR codes in this area that are interesting and fun to read. Okay, this is Ida Cummings, and she was the wife of a 3-term governor of Iowa, I believe 3 terms, and he was also a senator for Iowa after he was governor. She was a suffragist and president of Des Moines Women's Club. Her husband was Albert Baird Cumming, and they were both ardent suffragists. They were very supportive of the Iowa suffrage movement and the attempts to get a amendment to the Iowa Constitution passed. When they moved to Washington, D.C., when he became senator, she still came back often to help with her social causes, and her biggest interest was in child welfare. So she was, according to her obituary, she was the person who was most responsible for the Iowa child labor law that was passed while her husband was governor. And this is her sister-in-law, Cora Cummins, who was also a president of the Des Moines Women's Club and an ardent suffragist. So the Cummins are all buried in a plot just down the hill from the babies' cemetery. This is Grace Kramer, who formed what was called the Sunbeam Rescue Mission in Des Moines, which I had never heard of until I came across it in the Plymouth Church archives. She and her husband, Frank Kramer, ran the mission, which was apparently originally an idea from a Sunday school class at Plymouth Church, Mrs. A.Y. Rawson's Sunday school class. It was a mission that housed homeless men, unwed mothers, and their babies, and focused on the reclamation of prostitutes. But it was also a business enterprise and a restaurant, laundry, and kindling factory, and it had a free medical clinic and a job training and employment agency. So it was just an all-around social service agency run by these two people. It was pretty amazing. And they apparently worked for 11 years daily from 5 a.m. to 10:30 p.m. without a break. And finally, Grace got sick. And they were unable to replace the Kramers, and the mission ended at that point. So this is Rebecca Norris, and she was a very strong suffragist. She was married to a Judge Norris, and they called her Mrs. Judge Norris. She was very active in the early movement. You see, she was born in 1827, so she was quite a bit older than most of these women. She was born in Kentucky to parents of slave owners and came to Des Moines and became an abolitionist, which was interesting. Later on, she moved out of Des Moines and went to California and became an architect, but often came back to Des Moines to celebrate with the suffragists and help them they tried to pass an amendment for 50 years in Iowa, and they were never successful, but she came back for every one of those campaigns to try to help pass it. Now this is Delia Ann Webster. She was an abolitionist, and this is a picture of her with her sisters, and then a picture of her marker, which has 3 QR codes on it. She was the first woman who was jailed for being an Underground Railroad worker. She had a farm in Ohio that was right on the border, and she encouraged slaves to come across the border and hid them in her house. And at that time, the Fugitive Slave Act made it illegal to help a slave who was trying to move out of enslavement. She was jailed in her house because she claimed that she was too ill to go to a prison. And soon she escaped with the help of other abolitionists and moved north and became a famous speaker on the abolitionist speaking circuit. She did not move to Iowa until she was 83, and she came to live with her niece. I believe her niece was her only living relative at that point. And she's another person whose family kind of lost track of where she might have been buried and found out that she was buried in Des Moines. I believe they were looking for information about her because there are a number of abolitionists and Underground Railroad workers buried at Woodland. And during that project, her family found out where she was buried and replaced her marker with this new one. So she's quite an interesting national character. And then we go to Mary Orwig, and I think Mary has one of the most interesting monuments in the cemetery. She was a nationally known suffragist, and she was married to a Civil War veteran. So you can see the Civil War cannons on the top of their marker. And the Grand Army of the Republic marker is also there. She was a member of the Women's Army Relief Corps of the Grand Army of the Republic, which was kind of a social service organization, sorority adjunct to the Grand Army of the Republic that helped especially with orphans and widows of Civil War veterans. She was also very active in the WCTU and the Home for the Aged, and she was an active Methodist, which they always mention in her articles. Then there's Mary Helen Bayless Peters, who was an early president of the Des Moines Women's Club and a very active member of the DAR. So she's got a number of QR codes because the DAR has put all of their charter members' QR codes in the cemetery. Her claim to fame in the Des Moines Women's Club is her trolley car fundraiser for the Home for the Aged. Apparently, the Home for the Aged was on very shaky financial ground, and she came up with the idea of renting the Des Moines trolley cars for a day. And the Des Moines Women's Club got their daughters and young women to wear conductor outfits, and they collected money on the trolley cars that day, and that was the fee. They took donations for the Home for the Aged, and that was a very successful fundraiser. And we have a great picture of these are the Des Moines Women's Club members. I don't think they were the ones who acted as conductors, but this was the period when this fundraiser took place. She was also the first woman who was appointed to the Public Library Board when the new public library was formed in Des Moines. Then there's Alice Carey Wilson Whites, and she's got, the Whiteses have a big monument up on the hill on kind of the west end of the cemetery. She was a journalist and president of the Women's Club when they decided they wanted to build the auditorium at Hoyt Sherman Place. They got started before World War I, but were interrupted and stopped all their fundraising activities for the war. But after the war, the Women's Club raised all the money themselves. They issued their own bonds and did a big capital campaign, which was quite impressive for the time because women didn't have that much power and generally didn't have control over a lot of money. But these women, I'm sure that they got their husbands involved in the donation part of the project. But that theater was 100 years old this year. So there's a big celebration, and it's just a very successful theater even today. So this is Sarah Young, who was known as Aunt Becky during the Civil War. She was a Civil War nurse, and during the Civil War, she was a strong advocate for wounded soldiers, wanted them to be taken care of well. And after the war, she published a book of her memoirs called The Story of Aunt Becky's Army Life. She had kept a journal through the Civil War, but most of it was lost. She ended up with only the last 3 months of the Civil War. So her Aunt Becky story is mostly from memory and maybe embellished a bit. But she has some good stories, including one where she was supporting a wounded soldier's right to be sent back for better medical treatment. And the commanding officer didn't want to send him. But she sent him anyway without the permission of the commanding officer, who then went to General Sherman to complain. And General Sherman said, "There's nothing I can do about it. Aunt Becky outranks me." So that was her big story of the Civil War. And after the Civil War, she was very well liked and received a huge crowd when she was buried at Woodland Cemetery. Her grave has a big flag, and it's over by the receiving vault, so it's pretty easy to see. And right next to her is Callista Halsey Patchen. She was when she first started working, she was the first reporter for the Washington Post in Washington, D.C. First female reporter. She was an author, she wrote books, and she taught and was an artist. And her special artistic craft was woodworking. So she taught woodworking in several different cities. But then she married a Des Moines doctor, Dr. Patchen, and moved to Des Moines. And after that, she was no longer working as a professional journalist, but she was a charter member of the Des Moines Women's Club and was instrumental in getting the art gallery started at the Women's Club and the first art collections that the Women's Club had. She was kind of the advisor and the encourager. And what the Women's Club was doing under her guidance was trying to start the first art gallery in Des Moines. And before they had the gallery at Hoyt Sherman Place, they had an art collection, and they displayed it at the YMCA downtown and then the public library downtown. And then when they moved into Hoyt Sherman Place in 1907, they built the gallery that houses most of the art collection today. She was, as I said, the first woman reporter of the Washington Post. And a few years ago, they did a kind of a cartoon history of her. And this was one of the slides in the cartoon. They were very proud to have her as such an early reporter. And they used the information from the Des Moines Women's Club archives to write this story. Okay, Ellen Ward was the founder of the YWCA in town and a big supporter of the Sunbeam Rescue Mission that I mentioned earlier. She was a very active social reformer and worked mostly through Plymouth Church that had a lot of social reformers at the time. Eliza Cox Mitchell was another president of the Des Moines Women's Club. She negotiated the lease from the city for the Des Moines Women's Club clubhouse. She was a member of the library board when they were building the building that's now the World Food Prize. And there's a good story in the newspaper about how she maneuvered to get a tile floor on the new library building. This floor, the president of the library board wanted to make it cork because he thought it would be quiet and that was appropriate for the library. But she had gone all around the country looking at new libraries and argued that you had to have something that was lasting and beautiful. So with a lot of parliamentary maneuvering, she managed to get 4 out of 5 votes for the tile floor. And we're so thankful that that floor is still there and looking fabulous. The cork floor would probably have been gone in 10 or 15 years. So that was one of her big accomplishments. She was also the founder of the Iowa General Federation of Women's Club, which was a really big organization during this time when there were so many women's groups that were active. Okay, this is Alice Cheek, and she was a very active member of the Women's Relief Corps of the Grand Armory of the Republic, and her big talent was singing. And she sang at over 2,500 veterans' funerals. So she went all around the country singing at veterans' funerals. She's another woman who had a really large turnout for her burial at Woodland Cemetery. Okay, this is Jenny and Henry Bell, and they are a couple who were enslaved and freedom seekers, and they're buried at Woodland Cemetery. They came through the Jordan House, which was an Underground Railroad stop, and settled in Des Moines, and both became very active in the suffrage movement as well as community leaders in the African American community. Henry Bell and his wife were married when they were enslaved, and he was born in Virginia. They married and had 16 children. And when they escaped, they brought most of those 16 children with them. It must have been a harrowing escape. When he was still enslaved, he was near Corinth, Mississippi during the Second Battle of Corinth. And that was a battle that involved a lot of Iowa soldiers. So he was helpful in taking care of the sick and wounded soldiers from Iowa at the Battle of Corinth. And they think that that's how he learned about Iowa and decided he wanted to come here. So there are a number of people of color buried at Woodland Cemetery, and they're not in any separate sections. They're just around wherever they purchased a plot. So that was fairly forward thinking for Iowa at the time. There was not a separate cemetery for them. Okay, Elizabeth Heaton Hunter was a suffragist, and she was one of the people who was involved in a lawsuit that I'm going to talk about in a minute. She was a member of the Political Equity Club and was associated with Martha Callanan and the early voting rights movement. Her son, Fred, and his wife were also very active in the suffrage movement, and this is her daughter-in-law, Mary Ankeny Hunter. She was part of the Ankeny family, which had 5 daughters, I believe. And while Ankeny is named for them because they owned a lot of property there, they never lived in Ankeny. They always lived in Des Moines and were active in the suffrage movement. Mary Coggeshall was named for a lawsuit that the political suffrage club brought against the city of Des Moines. She and several other members of the club who owned property tried to vote in the election, the bond issue election that would have built City Hall. And they should have been eligible to vote because anyone who owned property was eligible to vote, but they were barred from voting. So they sued the city, and the election they couldn't use the results of the election till the suit was resolved. They lost in the appeals court, but went to the Iowa Supreme Court and won. So it held up the building of City Hall for several years, but they did get to vote in the subsequent bond issue election. Her attorney was Grace Holmes Ballantyne, who was the second female attorney in Iowa and got her law degree at Drake. She was the primary attorney for this case, but she was a member of the Bailey law firm. So Bailey also was part of the case. She later moved to Idaho and is buried in Idaho, but she is a notable Des Moines woman and was very influential in that early voting case. Then there's Alice Alvina Crawford Bailey Gorst, who was married to Bailey at the time. Her husband, William Henry Bailey, was an attorney for the Coggeshall case. Alice was president of the Women's Club, I believe, at the time of the lawsuit. And her portrait is at Hoyt Sherman Place now. It's believed that she had quite a bit of influence on her husband in the suffrage case, but her husband was also a strong supporter of the suffrage movement. Okay, Annice Baldwin Tracy was a nurse in the Civil War. She was born and lived on the east, I think it was Indiana, um, and was married and had 2 children and was widowed soon after her children were born. So she came to Iowa with her father, who was moving to Iowa, and her 2 daughters. But soon after she got here, the daughters also died. So she put up a monument at Woodland for the family, even though those members of the family are not buried there. She is buried in the Grand Army of the Republic plot because she was a Civil War nurse and a veteran of the Civil War. But when she was done nursing in the war, she came back to Des Moines and founded the Cottage Hospital and Tracy Home and Nursing School. Her cottage was over near 4 Mile Creek, and there was a famous railroad accident at 4 Mile Creek in 1877, and one of the cars on that train was the Barnum Circus train. A number of people were killed or injured because the bridge went out and the train went into the river. And her cottage hospital was nearby, and they took all the injured to her cottage hospital, including a number of performers from the circus. So when people were healed and the circus got back together, Barnum was so grateful to Tracy that he and Dr. Hannawalt was the doctor who helped at that time. He came back to Des Moines, and they held a circus fundraiser for the hospital to give them more financial support. And in 1893, she opened her school for nurses in Des Moines. This is a picture of the monument, which has her husband's name and her daughter's names, and then right underneath the monument is this little bed monument with 2 pillows, and that's for her daughters. And if you walk through Woodland Cemetery, you'll see a number of these little beds, and those are children's monuments that are very poignant and sad. There are a number of them right in this area of the cemetery. Okay, Kate Sibley Fowler ran for the school board in 1904. She didn't win that election. She was supported by the Des Moines Women's Clubs and the Federation of Des Moines Women's Clubs, and they paid her election costs. So that was early on. Women couldn't vote. She didn't win, but she was one of the early attempts to get an elected office. Martha Crosby Frisbee was married to Reverend Frisbee of the Plymouth Church, and he was very well known in the state. They went around the state speaking for abolitionist groups and also for suffrage groups. She was an educator. Before she married Reverend Frisbee, she taught in several women's colleges around the country. And then she also taught in Des Moines a bit. And of course was a very well-known Sunday school teacher, and her Sunday school members formed the Frisbee Club, and it still exists today. And then Frisbee School and Frisbee Park were named after them, and Frisbee School no longer exists, but Frisbee Park is still, and there's Frisbee Park neighborhood in town still today. Sarah Mills Clapp was known for her Civil War work and raised lots of money for fatherless families killed in the Civil War. Her grave was one of the first ones restored at Woodland Cemetery. There is a big project to restore monuments and clean monuments and set them up right in the cemetery, and it's all being done by private funds. The city does not maintain graves for families. That's the responsibility of the family. And for many of these graves, the families are either no longer in town or no longer exist. So this is a beautiful example of a restoration of a monument that happened in Woodland Cemetery. She was the president of Des Moines Women's Club and a very active suffragist. And during her year as president, the club purchased its first piece for the art collection, which was the Joan of Arc statue, which you can see in the lower level of Hoyt Sherman Place by the box office. Maria Orwig was another charter member of the Des Moines Women's Club and was a very active journalist. She was a friend of Savory and was somewhat appalled by the fact that Savory was run out of the leadership position. Savory apparently was her next door neighbor. She was a member of the Relief Corps and wrote a lot for the Women's Standard. Now this is Sarah Sherman, who was the wife of Hoyt Sherman and was the mistress of the house, Hoyt Sherman Place, when she was alive, and sister-in-law to General Sherman. But she died at 49 and was only in Hoyt Sherman Place for 10 years. And her sister moved into Hoyt Sherman Place because they had 5 children, and she moved in to help take care of the kids. And her interesting story, if you can call it that, her skull was stolen by vandals out of this monument in 1991. And it was reclaimed just a few days later. They thought it might have been teenagers who were into the occult. They broke into her monument and moved the bones around and took her skull. So right after that, this monument was bricked up. So there's no longer a door on this monument. Now the Coscaries were very influential in forming the art collection for Des Moines Women's Club. Their ancestor, Captain Nason Bartholomew Collins, was a ship captain and spent a lot of time in Europe and purchased a number of Old Master paintings, which he showed at the Metropolitan Museum in New York and then brought them to Des Moines. They were passed down from Elizabeth to Margaret, and Margaret donated them to the Women's Club. So there is at least one that you can still see, this one, which is Venus and Apollo. This one was sold by the foundation of Hoyt Sherman Place and is now on display at the London Gallery of Art. It's Lot and his daughters. There were a couple other paintings. In Memory of Church was sold at auction also to support the Hoyt Sherman Place Foundation, and that we have heard is now being displayed by Bill Gates in his home. So he was the purchaser. Corey Bussey Hillis was an activist in town and was a strong advocate for children and children's health. And she wanted the state legislature to form a teaching unit around children's health. And she went back to the legislature multiple times trying to get that done and was finally successful. But the first time she went, there was money available, and she thought they were going to vote on it. And then they voted to use that money for a new hog facility at the fairgrounds. So that was that was unfortunate. And Ding Darling had a cartoon in the paper the next day about how children don't really need all the help that hogs need. So the legislature was ridiculed for that move. And eventually she went back and finally got the money. And her argument was that children were not healthy in Iowa. And she used that her support was that during World War I, a large portion of the recruits from the Iowa area did not pass the physical. I think it was out of 230 recruits, one month, only 50 passed the physical. So that was her argument that really we can do better, and many of the things that kept them from being recruits could have been fixed if they'd been given good health care as children. Another claim to fame for Cora was the first Des Moines City Plan. She was part of the City Beautiful movement and felt that City Hall shouldn't make any more plans or do any more work on the riverfront until they had a plan, which seems pretty logical, but the City Council did not want to pay for a plan. And she went back and back and back. She was very persistent and feisty. And there are a number of articles in the paper describing how the City Council members didn't want to pay for it and ridiculed her for even thinking it was necessary. But finally, the council agreed that, yes, we could have a city plan, but she was going to have to find a way to pay for it because the city wouldn't pay for it. So she went to the Des Moines Women's Club and her friends, and they did raise the money and got their own city planner from Chicago to come. And they produced the first city plan, which included all the parks and the boulevards, Kingman Boulevard, Polk Boulevard, all the beautiful boulevards that have been built into our city. And we have Cora to thank for that. And at the end, we have a copy of the city plan, and she has a rather angry note that says, "We paid for it all ourselves because the city wouldn't pay for it." Then I have a few people that we don't usually get up to the Jewish Emmanuel Cemetery, but one really notable woman is Arma Mannheimer, who was a founding member of Planned Parenthood, member of the board. She was the first Jewish president of the Des Moines Women's Club and a board member of the Civic Music Association and a number of other music organizations in town. And she was married to Rabbi Mannheimer, and together they were founding members of the Des Moines Area Religious Council, which still exists today as an ecumenical religious council in town. And then there's Rose Frankel Rosenfeld, who was a very active suffragist. She was not politically visible, but a funder of the suffrage movement. This is a dress that she wore that's now in the Iowa State Fashion Museum. And she was a strong fighter for voting rights and especially funded the 1916 amendment to the Iowa Constitution. She's the mother of Louise Noun, who was an activist in Des Moines and art collector and philanthropist for the Des Moines Arts Center. And then this is my last lady who's buried in the Catholic cemetery. She's Ellen Keane Flynn, born in Ireland, and her home, the Flynn House, has been moved to Living History Farms. Now, they weren't a terribly wealthy family, but they did have a nice house and a large family. But when she moved here from Ireland, she worked as a domestic servant in the household of a wealthy lumber baron in Omaha. She was strongly anti-suffrage. She didn't want women to have the right to vote, and she was the president of the Des Moines anti-suffrage movement. But when she was visiting her family in California, she was converted to the suffrage movement. She was convinced that women should have the vote. There's Mom again. She went to a suffrage program at Yonkers that was in support of that 1916 vote, and stood on a chair and proclaimed that she'd been converted and that she thought women needed the right to vote. And that was a very influential thing. The vote still lost, but it was very impressive that she made a public stand because she was not especially a public person. So, and her home is now in Living History Farms, so we can all go and commune with Ellen Flynn. So that's the end of my list of ladies. We don't have much time for questions, but if you've got a question. Maybe I can answer. Questions? Wiki's coming up. No questions. We're going to do the tours again next summer. And Woodland is just a gorgeous place to walk around. So you might want to consider doing one. And the other two tours, the Civil War tour and the Archie Cook tour, are also very good.
Thank you. Amazing job. You can tell she was head of our Des Moines library. There isn't much Lorna doesn't know or won't find out for us. So what a wonderful program. Thank you so much for doing this today. We appreciate it. Wonderful job. So, and this was recorded today as well. So it will be on Facebook, I believe. So for those from YouTube. So thank you so much. Amazing. Amazing job. And I do think for those that are ambulatory, we should do the walk next year. If you would guide us through. So thank you so much. Oh, and talk a little bit about your movies coming up. I want to promo the movies that will be coming up.
We've got 4 weeks, or every other week, we're going to show a women's history movie. And the first one is 1:30 on Saturday, and it's Suffragette. It's a good movie and has some great actresses in it. So I recommend it, and then we'll be doing them every other week.
Every other week, yeah, for the next this month and next month. So and then we may pick it up again in January again. So thank you. That's great. Thank you for sharing them. Great job.